Okay, we're going to get started. So thank you so much for being here today. We're going to have a lunchtime lecture with a very, very special guest. My name is Margaret Hu. I'm a senior lecturing fellow here at Duke Law School. I'm an alum. I graduated in 2000. I'm on leave of absence from my position as Special Policy Counsel in the Office of Special Counsel for Immigration-Related Unfair Employment Practices in the Civil Rights Division. And I would have the honor today of introducing somebody who is both a hero and a legend, and he's earned that status. He's a hero and a legend to immigrants and those who work to protect the civil rights and the human rights of immigrants. And he's a hero and legend to those who believe in the aspirations of the Constitution and the ability of constitutional impact litigation to realize those aspirations. Lucas Guttentag is the Robina Foundation Distinguished Senior Fellow in Residence and Lecturer in Law at Yale Law School. Up until 2011, he served as the founding national director of the Immigrants Rights Project of the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation, which he established in 1985, and he headed for 25 years. Professor Guttentag is a fellow of the American Bar Foundation, named among California's top 100 lawyers and Appellate Lawyer of the Year. He's been honored as the Human Rights Hero by the ABA Human Rights Journal and a recipient of numerous other litigation and achievement awards. He's served as national spokesperson for the ACLU on immigration issues. He has testified before Congress and regularly speaks and writes on U.S. immigration law and constitutional issues. Professor Guttentag has litigated major class action and constitutional cases on behalf of immigrants throughout the United States for more than 25 years. He's argued landmark appeals, including in the United States Supreme Court, the California Supreme Court, and many federal circuits. He's testified before Congress and frequently speaks and writes on immigration law and civil liberties and is often quoted in national print and electronic media. Professor Guttentag successfully argued INS v. St. Cyr in the Supreme Court, preserving access to habeas corpus for immigrants. And he's argued many significant other cases and served as lead counsel or played a major role in class action litigation challenging, for example, the indefinite detention of Haitian refugees at Guantanamo base, challenged the nationwide class action, was involved in the nationwide class action settlement providing new asylum adjudications for more than 250,000 Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugees, and was involved in litigation to hold former Secretary Rumsfeld and high-level military commanders liable for the torture of Iraqi and Afghan civilians. Through his vision and leadership, the Immigrants Rights Project conducts the country's premier program of strategic impact litigation to advance the constitutional and civil rights of immigrants. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lucas Guttentag.
Hi, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. If someone heard that a hero and legend was going to be here, I know the only person who really qualifies is Coach K, but I'm going to pass on that. So it's really nice to be here, and I really want to thank the law school, the dean, and especially Margaret Hu for inviting me to speak with all of you today. So what I want to do, is there a clock? Oh, yeah. What I want to do is talk for a little while, and then I really welcome an opportunity to have a conversation and to answer questions. So, immigration is a huge controversy today, and it is admittedly a very complex, disputed, and difficult area. No one wants to disagree with that, but as my title suggests, what I want to do is bring a constitutional perspective, both in terms of protection of individual rights and the values that underlie our Constitution. So I want to spend a little bit of time doing that with all of you. I had the opportunity to be in Professor Hu's class earlier this morning, so some of you have heard me speak before. Others, I have some friends and former colleagues and members of the Immigrants Rights Project here, former members of the Immigrants Rights Project, which is great. So let me give you a little bit of my view of what the issues are, where we are, and maybe a little bit of where we're going. The fact that immigration is so controversial and controverted today that's nothing new in our history. And for those of you who studied this, know that we've always had a complicated relationship with immigration and immigrants in this country. It happens, and animosity and fear and hostility arises at different times, in different places, and in different forms. But it's never disappeared, and it never completely dominates our views or our values. From the earliest times of our republic, there was incredible reservations and fear about new immigrants. Everybody's faced it. When Catholics first started coming, they were viewed with suspicion and fear. Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and as everyone knows, the famous statement attributed to Benjamin Franklin, who said of the Germans in Pennsylvania, oh, well, they will never assimilate, never become real Americans. We have to prevent the Germans from dominating our culture. So this is nothing new. And there's also been a strong element, as we know, of race and racism and xenophobia in our immigration history. The first federal immigration laws targeted the Chinese. The Chinese exclusion laws, first enacted in 1882 and carried forward for a long time, were the result of incredible animosity towards Chinese immigrants in California at the end of at the conclusion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the determination that Chinese should not be members of our society. The Chinese exclusion laws were enacted. And that was only a part of it, because the hostility towards the Chinese and towards the other immigrant groups that I mentioned a moment ago culminated in what were called the National Origins Quotas Act of 1924, which was designed very specifically, explicitly, and unambiguously to preserve the ethnic makeup of the United States as it existed in 1890, before the great wave of Eastern European immigration, and it was specifically targeted to deny admission to new Jews, new Eastern Europeans, Catholics, and so on, and to exclude new immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, and to preserve the makeup of the United States as it existed in 1890. And every one of those new groups was seen as being dangerous, as being prone to criminality, as being lazy, and as not assimilating to the values and to the culture of the United States. And though that Quota Act wasn't ended until 1965, right, at the height of the last great era of civil rights legislation in this country. And what the 1965 immigration law did was to eliminate the discriminatory quotas that applied to the Eastern and Southern European countries. And what it was designed to do was to equalize immigration from all European countries. That was a very positive development. It was championed by Senator Ted Kennedy. The interesting part of that is that it also had a very significant impact on Mexico and on Latin America in ways that are sometimes forgotten or not recognized. Because while the 1965 law equalized immigration from European countries in at least a formalistic way by applying the same numerical limit to every country rather than the limit based on the population from 1890, what it also did between 1965 and 1976 is for the first time imposed numerical limits on immigration from Mexico and ultimately from the entire Western Hemisphere. And that regulation, in the view of many, did not take into account the particular relationship, the particular history, and the particular dynamics between the United States and Mexico. So while we had, by 1976, a system of formal equality in terms of the number of immigrants from each country who could legally immigrate to the United States, we also, for the first time, had those limits imposed on Mexico and on Latin America. Because until 1965, there were no numerical limits on the number of qualifying Mexicans and other Latin Americans who could immigrate to the United States. Now, it's worth remembering, and I'm sure many of you know this, that the history of our southern border is interesting, right? Until 1848 and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, New Mexico were all part of Mexico. And of course, Texas was until Texas War of Independence, and then ultimately part of the treaty and became part of the United States. So, you know, there's this saying that gets thrown around sometime by Mexican Americans living in the southwest of the United States that says, we didn't cross the border crossed us. That's not without some truth. Now, that isn't to question in any way, obviously, the legitimacy or the validity of the border, but it is to acknowledge the historical development of the United States and of migratory patterns that continue to exist to this day. So it wasn't really until 1976, when the modern era went fully into effect, that we have the current system whereby immigration is numerically limited both from all of Europe, from all of Latin America, and all around the world. Now, the dynamics of migration, the reasons for migration are just as complicated, just as disputed, and just as complex as the issues related to contemporary policies. And I don't want to suggest in any way that there's a single way to think about this, and I welcome divergent views, and I really want to engage in a discussion about this, but I think it's worth thinking about how we got to where we are, both historically and in terms of more recent events. So before turning to those, I just want to go back to the one part of the title of my talk, which says, refers to the constitutional perspective. So what is the constitutional perspective on immigration? Well, let me start. Excuse me, I'm feeling a little under the weather, so I'm occasionally going to have to just make sure I don't sneeze into the microphone here. So what are those constitutions? Well, first and fundamentally, that the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution speaks, that says that every person is entitled to due process of law. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution says that every person is entitled to due process and equal protection of the laws. It doesn't say citizens. It doesn't, and that's not an accident. There are provisions of the Constitution that speak specifically to citizens, the Privileges and Immunity Clause, the issue, who can become a president of the United States, and other provisions. So the framers of the Constitution were well aware of the meaning of citizenship, and significantly, the framers of the 14th Amendment were as well, but the core protections of the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause guarantee that right to every person, not just to every citizen. Now, you know, I've been noticing that there's been a number of celebrations recently regarding the, I think it's the commencement of the Civil War, right? So, which is obviously a very significant historical event. But from the civil rights and constitutional perspective, the critical development is not the beginning but the end, and in particular, the Reconstruction Congress and the enactment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the so-called second founding of the United States. Again, in terms of that Congress, those provisions of the Constitution and the values reflected in our core document, it's significant that it was enacted not only, of course, critically, to give protection to the newly freed slaves, to African Americans in the United States, to end the sin and the horror of slavery, but also to recognize the discrimination, the hostility, and the lynching of Chinese in California. The Civil Rights Act of 1865 and 1870, that's now codified in Section 1981 of the Federal Civil Rights Statutes, guarantees the same right to contract and protection of the laws to every person as to white citizens. And what the framers intended was to give equal protection to every person the same as white citizens, contrasting not just black and white, but also citizen and non-citizen. And that was, again, directly responsive to the treatment of the Chinese, who were not citizens of the United States, who could not be citizens of the United States at that time. And you've read in constitutional law one of the great cases in the constitutional canon, Yickwo versus Hopkins. Well, what's Yickwo known for? It's known for the equal protection case that protected, that outlawed the discriminatory San Francisco, my city of birth, the ordinance enacted by the city of San Francisco regarding the laundries, the outlawing of non-brick laundries, and the court held that statutes that discriminatory intent, even if facially neutral, is nonetheless a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Well, who were the targets of that San Francisco ordinance? Chinese non-citizens. And what the court was holding was that non-citizens of the United States, subject to the discrimination by the city of San Francisco, were protected by the Equal Protection Clause, and that ordinance was unconstitutional. So from the very beginning, there was a recognition, after the Civil War, there was a recognition of the scope of the civil rights and constitutional rights protections. Now, recently, another case that many are not so familiar with has become prominent, the so-called Wong Kim Ark case, which had to do with the issue of citizenship under the 14th Amendment. In Wong Kim Ark, a native-born child of a Chinese national was born in the United States, and the argument was that either he or she, I now don't remember, I'm fairly certain it was a he, but I'm not positive. The issue was, well, is he a citizen of the United States? And the argument was, no, he's not. Why? Because his parents were not citizens, were prohibited from becoming citizens. It's difficult to remember what the status of Chinese living in the United States was at that time. They were prohibited by law from naturalizing, from becoming United States citizens. And they were deemed to be, and the argument with regard to Wong Kim Ark was that he couldn't be a United States citizen under the 14th Amendment because his parents were subjects to the Emperor of China. They did not owe their loyalty to the United States of America, but owed their loyalty to the Emperor of China. So how could he possibly be a citizen of the United States? And so therefore, he couldn't be, shouldn't be, and was not protected by the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court categorically rejected that argument. I'm happy to talk more about how that applies in the current controversy regarding constitutional citizenship. My friend, colleague, and your own Walter Dellinger has testified extensively about that very question when he was in the Clinton administration. He's written about it significantly and testified eloquently that there is no way to interpret the 14th Amendment other than to guarantee citizenship to every single person born in the United States, including those whose parents are here in undocumented status. And Garrett Epps, a graduate of this law school, has recently written another extensive article canvassing the history of the 14th Amendment and why that has to be. But let me, I'm happy to come back and talk about that during the conversation. So how did we get to the situation where we are today, where issues like citizenship, where there's this incredible fear, concern, hostility towards undocumented immigrants? As I already said, the dynamics are as complicated and as complex as the points of view that there are today. I don't think it can be separated from the history that I wanted to review just very briefly with you. But let me talk a little bit about some of the more contemporary dynamics. First, there's been, I'm going to put this away and try to keep my eye on the clock. There's been enormous changes in the enforcement practices regarding immigration and in the demographics of immigration. First, in that respect, there's been this overarching dynamic of a steady increase in border enforcement, interior detention, and deportation. There are now more people deported from the United States every year than at any time in our history. And that has continued into the current administration, and there's no signs of it abating. The number of individuals detained is higher than at any time in our history. The number of immigration detention beds that are available is higher than ever and is growing apace, either by virtue of prisons, detention centers built by the federal government, leased from state and county jails, or increasingly built and rented from private correctional institutions. The privatization of incarceration in this country is a significant issue, and it has a particular impact in the context of immigration, not exclusively, but significantly. There was a very interesting report on NPR a few months ago about the role, the alleged role, of one of the private correctional corporations in the enactment of the so-called SB 1070, the most recent immigration regulation or anti-immigrant law enacted in the state of Arizona. So there's been an enormous increase in detention, deportation, and enforcement, both at the border and in the interior, and it shows no signs of abating. At the same time, there's been an incredible growth in the population of undocumented immigrants, migrants in the United States. The number now is in the neighborhood of 11 million. It's always difficult to estimate, but that's the number that is the most widely accepted at this point. So notwithstanding the enforcement, the population is at our highest or near the highest it's ever been. And significantly, the third factor in terms of the enforcement and demographics is over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, the immigrant population has dispersed around the United States in a way that was not true in the recent past. North Carolina had the fastest growth of new immigrants between 1990 and 2000. It was #1 in the country, and between 2000 In 2008, it was number 7 in the country. And the highest, fastest growing states for immigrants are all states that in the past have not had high influx of migrants. California, Texas, Chicago, the traditional receiving, New York, Florida, traditional receiving states, have not had the same level of growth. And particularly with regard to Mexican and Central American immigrants, which make up by far the greatest proportion of the so-called illegal alien population. Those have gone traditionally gone overwhelmingly to California, Texas, and Chicago, and now are dispersed around the United States. Of the undocumented population, roughly 55% is Mexican, and if you add in Salvadoran and Guatemalan, it's roughly 80% of the undocumented population. So you ask, why do I focus so much on the history of Mexico and Latin America and so on? Because that's what the issue is about in terms of undocumented immigration. And that population is now in many parts of the country where it has traditionally not been. And I want to come back in a moment to talk about why that is. So the first is enforcement and demographics. A second dynamic that I think it's important to keep in mind that I'm not going to talk about really is globalization and trade and NAFTA. You know, we can't really talk about migration without talking about international dynamics and international policies and international development that affect the countries, and particularly, again, Mexico, from which migrants come. And it's a very interesting conversation, and those who know a lot about it can tell you about the impacts of NAFTA. And while it may have spurred a great deal of growth in some sectors of the economy, it has also had enormous dislocating effects for the family agricultural economy of Mexico and set people in motion and in ways that had not happened before. NAFTA came into effect in 1994, so this is relatively recent. Third, and critically from my perspective, are immigration laws and policies that have been enacted in recent years that contribute to all of this. And I want to go through just a few of them very briefly. First, and critically, the 1996 immigration laws. This was enacted, the 1996 immigration law was part of the year in which the Welfare Reform Act, the prison litigation, so-called Prison Litigation Reform Act, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, and the Illegal Immigration and Immigrant Responsibility Act were enacted. They were all very significant, and especially the immigration law, exceedingly technical changes in the immigration law. In various statutes and with immigration and the immigration laws. What's significant is what the 1996 immigration law did was enact a host of provisions that took enormous flexibility out of the system, that imposed mandatory removal of many people who previously had been eligible for various forms of discretionary relief, and created a series of weird, perverse incentives that actually penalized people for getting legal status because of the procedures that had to be employed, and that then subjected them to bars on returning from the United States if they pursued their opportunities to get legal status. In addition, it ramped up the detention that I mentioned a moment ago. So the 1996 laws changed in very subtle but critical ways the flexibility in the immigration system and took away or limited the opportunity for many people to get legal status. The second significant development was, of course, critically 9/11. We can't talk about contemporary immigration policy without looking at the aftermath and the consequences of 9/11. What's interesting is that 9/11 and the Patriot Act and the disputed provisions of it did not actually enact significant legislative changes to federal immigration law. What 9/11 did was more a matter, or the policies after, was more a matter of policies, rules, practices, and there were some very significant ones, and money. The enforcement at the border dramatically changed after 9/11 because of the resources that were poured into that effort. And of course, the mindset, the gestalt of immigration changed significantly because it was seen more and more as a national security issue, which is always an issue, but after 9/11 predominantly so. But I would say the critical effect of 9/11 has been the influx of resources into enforcement, and particularly at the border. And then the third change in recent periods of time was the failure of comprehensive immigration reform. The failure of Congress to enact significant changes, and in particular, a so-called legalization or amnesty provision of some kind, broad or narrow, to address the undocumented population, to provide a path to legal status. As a result of that, I think there was enormous local frustration with the failure of the federal government to act. And I think the prospect, so the failure triggered a lot of local action, and the prospect that it might get enacted before it failed mobilized a huge cohort of those who were opposed to immigration reform and who mobilized in a massive way, and in particular on the local level. The last thing I want to mention that changed, that's a factor in our current circumstances, is the financial meltdown of 2008. You can't look at immigration without thinking about economic circumstances, employment needs, the circumstances of the economy generally. But I think it's worth noting that the locus of the greatest hostility to immigration does not correlate with places of high unemployment. California has a higher unemployment rate than the national average by far. The California unemployment rate is in the neighborhood of 12.5%. The national unemployment rate is somewhere between 9 and 9.5%. California is not the place where there's great hostility to immigration. So I don't want to divorce economic circumstances or employment or unemployment from immigration, but it's not necessarily the kind of one-to-one correlation or the immediate trigger that we often think about. I think what's going on, especially at the state and local level, is much more a function of local dynamics, local demographics, and local politics. And so let me just go to the question of why are there so many undocumented immigrants in the United States? What's going on here, and why are we at this historic high? Relatedly, is everyone trying to come? Are we in a situation where everybody who could come would come, or everybody wants to come, and it's only because of the borders, the enforcement, and the efforts at building a wall that keeps people out? And I'm not a demographer, I'm not a labor economist either. I'm a constitutional civil rights lawyer, so I'm most comfortable talking about the Constitution. But let me just tell you what those who study this say. And I would refer you especially to Doug Massey, who is at Princeton and who's studied Mexican migration for the last 30 years in a very detailed, nuanced, and empirical way. And what he would say, and what he has said, is that basically we have a certain level of migration from Mexico, going back really to the historic patterns that I talked about and to the era before that, going back to the 1920s, of in the neighborhood of 500,000 Mexicans a year. Legal immigrants, temporary workers, and that's been the number consistently over a long period of time. And the migration is much more a function of economic and other dynamics and borders and relationships between countries than it is about laws and regulation, barriers and walls. In fact, he would say that the enforcement efforts at the border since 1986, and particularly what's happened since 9/11, has had the completely perverse effect of increasing the undocumented population in the United States. Why is that? Because historically that migration is circular. People come, they work. When the jobs dry up, they leave. During holidays and significant family events, they go home. And so there's a circular migration pattern, which I think has a lot to do with where that border used to be, and it's been manifested in recent decades. What happens when you increase increase the enforcement at the border and make it difficult for people to return? Less than keeping people out, it locks people in. Those who are here do not leave, because the cost of reentry is so high and the risk of not returning that they'll stay. And as the cost of entry goes up, because of the difficulty and the cost of coyotes and the greater enforcement, the immediate response is to stay longer in order to pay back that initial cost. The locking in effect causes people to stay. And if a worker is in the United States and is staying, what's the first thing that he, typically as a he, does is bring his family members. And so you've created a dynamic where people stay, and then they bring their family members, and then they settle, and that population stays rather than leaving. Relatedly, the increase in enforcement, particularly in Southern California and in Texas, in the places where there's large urban areas between the United States and Mexico, there's been a huge increase in enforcement there and barriers and so on. What was that intended to do, and what has it had the effect of doing? Funneling migration through the desert, and in particular through Arizona. And so there's been a real change in the migratory patterns from California and Texas into Arizona. And that in turn then, because people were traveling through Arizona, and in particular during the period of time when Arizona's economy was booming and the housing industry was growing and the need for workers was great, migrants, instead of going to California, Texas, and Chicago, where they traditionally went, what did they do? They stayed in Arizona. And that's what happened. And so the population in Arizona grew significantly. And then the bust happened, and then the reaction has come. And so we've seen a particular focal point in Arizona. Now, that's not the only explanation. And as I said, I think it's also a function of politics and other things. But that's been part of what's happened in Arizona in particular, combined with this dynamic that I mentioned earlier of the dispersal of the new immigrant populations to many, many places around the country: Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, rural Pennsylvania, Iowa, Nebraska, places where immigrants have not been in generations. As a result, there's been a reaction. And part of that reaction is to blame immigrants for crime, for costs, for budget impacts, and so on. And some would say there's some truth to that, and I'm sure there is. And others would say that it's much more complicated than it has to do with people leaving certain rural areas and moving to the city and so on. All I know is that the first city that passed an anti-immigrant ordinance was Hazleton, Pennsylvania. And we filed a lawsuit against Hazleton. And the mayor, who's now a member of Congress, who supported the Hazleton ordinance, said that the illegal immigrants, were costing the city money, causing crime, imposing on services, and busting the budget. Well, in that particular case, after a 2-week trial, we examined all those allegations. And we had a chance to actually do it in a court of law. And what did we find? That the hospital had gone from being in the red to being in the black, that there was now a surplus, not a deficit, and that the crime rate had gone down. So don't believe what you hear, examine it, and probe, and let's find out. And, the impact on jobs and on labor markets, I think, is very, very complicated. It's been studied extensively. The one thing I would say is that the critical issue in my mind is providing workplace protections for every single person, regardless of immigration status, so that every person can enforce their labor rights without fear of retaliation and without fear of deportation. That's critical for the workers, and it's critical for the American workforce. Because if you have a workforce, some of whom cannot enforce their rights, it diminishes the opportunities, the protections for all. That's not the law as it exists today, and that's one of the critical elements that needs to change, is to provide equal protection for all workers. It's formalistically present in some respects, but as a practical matter, it's not. So let me say two things about the citizenship issue, and then let me wrap up so that we can talk a little bit. As I mentioned, Walter Dellinger has testified about this extensively. Professor Jerry Newman did as well. To reject the notion that there's any historical basis for arguing that the children of those born in the United States whose parents are in uncertain immigration status or less than permanent residents or less than United States citizens are not themselves citizens of the United States. I'm happy to talk about what that little phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, means, on which the counterargument hinges. It was designed historically to address foreign ambassadors invading armies and Native Americans who at that time were under their own jurisdictional grounds. Newman especially has done a lot of historical work to show that, to respond to the argument that since the 14th Amendment predated federal immigration regulation, how could the framers have had in mind so-called illegal aliens? And he demonstrates that, in fact, there was immigration regulation at the state level. There was also the concept of illegal persons because there were escaped slaves who were deemed as illegal under the law. So it's not that this is some historical anomaly. But I would say more fundamentally that citizenship for every person born in the United States, it's one of the absolute critical engines of equality in our country. You know, this is one of the things that's quintessentially American, and it's one of the cornerstones for how our society operates and how we integrate, assimilate, and move forward as a society. And to me, it's hard to think of a more misguided policy than one that would create the kind of divisiveness that those who advocate for this would envision. But we can come back to that. So let me just say in closing, sort of where do we go from here? How do we respond to this? And I would say a few things. One is we need to recognize immigration is complex. I keep saying it. I want to acknowledge it. There are many divergent views on this. It's ultimately not a function of laws or rules. It's a function of human dynamics, and I think we have to recognize it as such. There are 200 million migrants in the United States, in the world today, persons living outside their borders. This is a huge challenge for all developed countries and for developed democracies, how to deal with the question of global migration. In my view, the United States does it better, more inclusively, more humanely than any other country in the world. We are a nation of immigrants. It's something we celebrate, and rightfully so. It's something we should be proud of, and rightfully so. The Statue of Liberty is an icon for a real reason. This is a core part of our being and of us as a nation. That's one part of our history. And the other part I've already talked about, the fear, the xenophobia, the racism. That's nothing new either. Both are present. Both are always there. And our struggle is to ensure that that better part of our national story predominates. And I think the key to that is seeing immigration not as an historical artifact that happened sometime in the past, but as an ongoing dynamic that continues to happen. There wasn't one period in our history where immigration happened, created America, and then we move forward. It's always continued, it's always ongoing, and it's going to continue. And it's going to continue to change America. Because what are we supposed to look back to? What period exactly? Like the 1940s and Japanese internment, 1950s, Jim Crow, 1960s, when women and African Americans had to fight for equality, 1970s, 1980s under Ronald Reagan, we had the last amnesty where undocumented immigrants got legal status in the United States. So to me, it's fundamentally a question of, do we celebrate change or do we fear it? Because we are going to change, it's going to continue to happen. Immigrants change America, and America changes immigrants. But don't be misled by the notion that today's immigrants are not learning English, are not assimilating. They are. English language classes are oversubscribed. There's a desperate need for more classes for people who want to learn English. Everyone knows that's the path to success in this country. Are immigrants causing crime? Professor Jeff Fagan at Columbia Law School has studied crimes. Immigrant communities are the safest places to live in America, is what he says. And I think we have to believe and truly incorporate that diversity makes us stronger. You know, are there problems? Are there challenges? Are there transitional things? Of course, of course. I don't want to minimize that at all, but do we have to worry that U.S. culture is being overwhelmed somehow? MTV, McDonald's, Nike, television, movies, it's all over the world. To me, that's a false fear. To me, what I would say is that our values are the most threatened by those who would say that torture is permissible under U.S. law, that detention without trial should be permitted under the United States Constitution, that the First Amendment should be limited based on what a person says, or that citizenship is not available to every single person born in the United States. So I feel like we need to do, instead of fear, we need to work together to solve real problems, not blame immigrants, not blame Latinos, not fear Muslims or people of other faith, and continue with the vision of progress and diversity and equality and justice that is the fundamental set of American values. And so let me just close by being clear about, it's never easy. It's always a struggle. At every period of our history, there's been issues that we've been confronted, and we move forward when every single one of us does what's in our personal and professional ability to contribute to that struggle, whether it's a little or a lot, based on our circumstances, our interests, our opportunities. But the one thing I want to say since I'm here is that lawyers are uniquely positioned to play a role in the struggle for social justice. You're all going to be lawyers. Well, maybe not every single one of you, maybe, but all of you are going to be lawyers. All of you who are in law school are going to be lawyers much sooner than you think. And there's just a countless number of ways for you to play a role in this based on what you believe in ways that are realistic for you to do. And in the end, it's all about the struggles that we choose to engage in based on our lives, our beliefs, and our values to ensure what I believe are the enduring values of the Constitution. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I welcome your questions and your comments. Yeah.
I'm wondering what you see as the best kind of contours of a legislative solution to the large number of undocumented immigrants. I mean, you mentioned the amnesty sort of program that was granted in the 1980s. Do you see that, or is there some other way to deal with that?
So first of all, I have two things I want to say. One is that the ACLU, as a formal matter, does not have a position on this, and so I'm speaking not in my capacity. I'm speaking in my academic, scholarly, and individual capacity. The second thing is, you know what I think? I think we ought to have a statute of limitations. I think we ought to take the principle that if the law is not enforced against somebody after a certain period of time, they're eligible for legal status. Rather than periodic legalization programs that are fraught with political disputes and so on, there ought to be a mechanism by which, after a certain period of time, people gain legal status. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't create a different set of problems. Are we creating incentives for people to come and so on and so forth? But there is a provision in the immigration law called registry, which provides essentially that. It says if anybody's been here since before X date and they're a person of good moral character, they're eligible for legalization, legal permanent residence status. The problem is that X date hasn't been updated since 1986, and so now it refers to 1972, and before that it was 1948. But we now have the biggest gap, or virtually the biggest gap we've ever had on that provision. So that's one big thing. I think we just need to have a mechanism by which it can be regularized. And the second thing is I think we have to restore the flexibility that existed in the law before 1996. There were lots of mechanisms for people to gain legal status that are no longer available. And the third is we have to remove some of those perverse incentives that were enacted in 1990 that lock people into undocumented status who could otherwise gain it. Yes?
I have a question sort of about empirical issues. I don't know if you...
Excuse me?
I guess my question is about the costs. Just a lot of times when people talk about immigration and undocumented workers, it's about the cost that they impose on society. And obviously there's a benefit, like a value generated by them working and creating value. But in terms of just like cost versus taxation revenue coming from undocumented workers and things like that.
Right.
Are they paying taxes? Is there ever any revenue coming in from that?
So again, there's no, first of all, I want to make my disclaimers even longer. I'm not an economist and so on. But let me just say what I think, which is, first, it varies. Do people pay taxes? Yes. They do as a general matter. It depends on how they're paid and so on. They do, in terms of income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes. They pay their property taxes either through rent or through owning property. They pay their sales taxes every time they go to the store. They pay gasoline taxes every time they fill up their car and so on. So there's no doubt that people pay taxes. The extent to which the taxes are similar or different has been studied. I don't know that there's any definitive answers. I think overall the view is that they pay roughly the same, maybe more, I don't know. The other big, on the benefit side, is they don't draw down on Social Security. Some people say the Social Security system is solvent basically because, I don't know if it is solvent, but to the extent that it's solvent or potentially solvent or however solvent it is, it's because of contributions made by people who will never benefit from the system. So there's huge offsetting benefits. The complicated areas, I think, are in part education and maybe some other areas. I think there's a big problem in this country that has nothing to do with immigration about how benefits are paid for and how taxes are collected. And so certain states and certain localities contribute way more to the federal budget than they get back. And I think if we wanted to try to deal with these issues, we would look at how taxes are collected and distributed more than look at immigrants. And overall, what labor economists and economists generally would tell you is that immigrants contribute enormously to the economic vitality and growth. And there's a reason why Japan is suffering the consequence it does, why there's a labor shortage in Germany, why the United States is vibrant and continues to attract workers is because of our economy, which is significantly a function of immigration and young workers, many of whom are immigrants. But are there ways in which the tax structure could be adjusted? I think absolutely. But I wouldn't make it an immigration issue. I think it's a broader issue, but a very, very important one.
This may be too broad a question, but I'm really curious about your work in terms of sort of constitutional reform strategy through litigation. And I'm wondering, I guess, just sort of broadly how, in the work you do with ACLU, you think methodologically about constructing a constitutional reform program.
All right, so can everybody hear the question is, what about constitutional litigation? And, are you not paying attention to who's on the Supreme Court and what world do you live in? That isn't what you said, but that's part of the question. So let me just say that, first of all, I teach a whole course on this because I think it's a really interesting and important question. And I would say in brief, one is, I think litigation is an absolutely critical part of defending individual rights and advancing social justice. But to say it's a critical part is not to say it's the only part, is not to say it exists in isolation, is not to say that it isn't profoundly influenced by political and other realities. So I think we have to do it, but we have to do it cognizant of where it fits in to a broader strategy. And then secondly, I think it has to be very, very strategic. I think some issues are better litigated, some issues are better not. And the thing that I try to tell students and everybody is when you're thinking about a case, think about first what your goal is. What are you trying to accomplish with this case? Are you seeking a compensation for the individual? Are you seeking structural reform? Are you seeking a change in a legal interpretation? Are you seeking to draw attention to a problem? Are you seeking to obtain information about something that's operating in secret? Those are all very, very different goals. And I think we want to think about what's the goal when we start the litigation. Because if the goal is, I want to get a great decision from the United States Supreme Court on a question of law, that's not impossible. I've argued a case, we got a great decision. But I wouldn't want to build my career around those kinds of cases under these circumstances. So it's a great question. It's a complicated answer. And the role of the media, the role of political organizing, the role of community-based groups is critically, critically important.
You were talking before about the bars to gaining legal status that have been put in place with legislation over the past couple of decades. I think we were discussing earlier, one of the biggest problems is that all of the discretion has been taken away from immigration judges. And I'm just wondering if you have a general feeling for whether in today's current climate, if that discretion were sort of reinserted into the process, would it be exercised? Would the immigration judges welcome it?
That's a good question, too. So one of the things that's interesting is, as a general matter, as lawyers and in law schools and that sort of thing, we're very, very wary of discretion, right? We like clarity, we like rules, we like certainty, we worry about arbitrariness, and so on, all of which I think is really important. In the immigration world, unfortunately, what's happened is the discretion has been taken away at the cost of any way to ameliorate what are otherwise really harsh laws. And the immigration laws have always swept very, very broadly in terms of bringing people into their ambit for purposes of deportation or penalties. And discretion was the way of softening that. So I think it's important to restore it, even though it would be better to actually reform the law more broadly. How would it be exercised? I think it's hard to say. I think in some cases, absolutely. I think there's a lot of immigration judges and adjudicators out there who were desperate to have more discretion to give relief to worthy cases. And there are others who have probably gotten out of the habit of thinking about it, but over time that can change. So I think it would vary widely.
I know that a lot of farms and private industries kind of play a role in...
Private what? I'm sorry?
Private industries kind of play a role in immigration, like recruiting from Mexico or even having kind of special relationships with enforcement. So I guess what role do you think it's going to end up, which way do you see that playing out in the future in terms of immigration reform?
The role of private recruiters and so on?
The role of these big industries, basically groups that have a lot of money and have a lot of voice in the direction of future.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. One of the interesting things in terms of the political debate over immigration is that there are interesting, some would say odd, allies / bedfellows, right? That there's a lot of business interests that are closely allied on questions of immigration reform with progressive groups because of the because the interests coalesce. And there are some, like the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the Cato Institute to a certain extent, and so on, that view migration across borders more akin to movement of capital. That if capital can move freely, why shouldn't workers move freely? That, of course, has to be coupled with worker protections, which might not be as high on the list of some of those business groups. And in my view, protecting, enhancing, and advancing the ability of organized labor to bargain collectively and to organize workers to collectively enforce rights. But I would say overall, the business community in many respects has been in favor of addressing some of the problems in the immigration system. Now, then there's the issue of outsourcing and so on. But I think, and I don't know about the recruiters in particular, but a lot of the business community has been very supportive of immigration reform.